The smell of bleach and copper hit me before I even pushed through the emergency room doors. My boots felt incredibly heavy on the white linoleum floor. 14 times, that was the number echoing in my head. My little girl, heavily pregnant with my first grandchild, was somewhere behind those swinging medical doors, fighting to breathe. And the cowards who put her there were currently sitting in a warm police station drinking free coffee and lying through their teeth. I spent 20 years in special forces. I have seen the darkest corners of the world, walking through deserts and foreign cities where human life meant absolutely nothing. When I finally retired, I thought I had left the monsters behind. I thought the hardest part of my life was over. I just wanted to build a quiet life, fix old cars in my garage, and watch my beautiful daughter, Amelia, become a mother. Amelia was my only soft spot. She had my stubborn jaw, but her mother's kind, forgiving eyes. A few months ago, Amelia's husband, Hunter, passed away in a tragic car accident. It broke her heart into a million pieces. She was left all alone in that massive cold family estate that Hunter's family owned. Hunter's older brother, Julian, never liked Amelia. Julian was a greedy, arrogant man who believed the family wealth belonged only to him and his 5 grown sons: Blake, Colin, Evan, Felix, and Grant. I always knew Julian was a snake, but I never imagined the depths of his pure evil. I never thought he would look at a grieving pregnant widow and see a threat to his bank account. I stood in the waiting room, staring blankly at the television mounted on the wall. The news was playing, but there was no sound. My hands were shaking, not from fear, but from a deep, dangerous anger that was slowly waking up inside my chest. It was a cold, calculated rage that I had kept locked away in a dark box for years. If you have ever felt the burning need to protect your family from monsters hiding in plain sight, hit like, subscribe for Betrayal Stories Lab, and comment your city or country, because what I did next was not just about anger, it was about absolute justice. The heavy double doors of the intensive care unit finally swung open. A young doctor walked out, her name tag read Daphne. She looked exhausted, her green scrubs stained with dark red patches that made my stomach drop. She walked straight toward me, taking a deep breath before she spoke. "Victor," she asked softly, "how is she?" My voice did not even sound like my own. It sounded hollow, like it was coming from a ghost. Dr. Daphne crossed her arms, shivering slightly despite the warm hospital air. "She is the strongest woman I have ever treated. She was struck 14 times. The blade missed her vital organs by mere millimeters. She lost a massive amount of blood. Victor, we had to put her in a medically induced coma to let her body attempt to heal. It is going to be a very long, very critical night." "And the baby?" I whispered, almost too terrified to hear the answer. A faint, tired smile touched Daphne's lips. "The baby is holding on. Heartbeat is faint but steady. Your daughter wrapped her arms around her stomach during the attack. She took every single strike to her back and shoulders to protect the child. She saved that baby's life. I had to lean against the wall to keep from falling to my knees. My brave, beautiful Amelia. She fought off a pack of wolves to protect her unborn child." I thanked Dr. Daphne, my jaw tight, and watched her walk back through the doors. Before I could even process the medical report, the heavy glass doors of the waiting room slid open. Detective Adrian walked in. He was a tall, sharp-looking man in a wrinkled suit holding a small notepad. He had known me for years. He knew my military background, and he knew how much Amelia meant to me. He refused to look me in the eye as he approached, staring down at his shoes instead. "Tell me Julian is in a cell," I said, my voice dangerously low. Detective Adrian sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "Victor, I need you to stay calm. Julian is not in a cell, neither are his sons." The air in the room suddenly felt freezing cold. "Explain." Adrian finally looked up and I could see the pure frustration and disgust in his eyes. "Julian has high-priced lawyers crawling all over the precinct. They already submitted a formal statement. Julian claims that Amelia suffered a severe pregnancy-induced psychotic break. He is telling a judge that she showed up at the main house holding a kitchen knife, threatening to burn the estate down. Julian claims he only used force to disarm her. He stabbed her 14 times to disarm her," I asked, taking a slow step forward. "He claims he panicked in the dark," Adrian said, his tone bitter, "and his 5 sons, Blake, Colin, Evan, Felix, and Grant, they all gave the exact same matching statement. They said they blocked the exits to keep Amelia from running out into the street and hurting herself. They said they were trying to contain her. It is a perfectly rehearsed ironclad lie." It's 5 witnesses against a woman who is currently in a coma and cannot speak for herself until Amelia wakes up and gives a different statement. My hands are entirely tied by the district attorney. I cannot arrest them. Victor, I stared at the detective for a long time. I processed the tactical reality of the situation. Julian had the money, he had the numbers, he had the corrupted influence to spin a story of self-defense. The legal system was built for people who played by the rules, and Julian was using those rules as a shield. The police were going to do absolutely nothing. The law was going to let the men who nearly butchered my pregnant daughter walk completely free. Thank you, Adrian, I said quietly, turning my back on him. Victor, please, Adrian warned, stepping closer. Do not do anything foolish. Let me work the investigation. Let me find a hole in their story. I didn't answer him. I walked slowly toward the intensive care window. I looked through the thick glass into the dimly lit room. I saw my daughter laying there surrounded by machines, pale and fragile. I placed my hand flat against the cold glass. In that exact moment, the grieving father vanished. The man who wanted a quiet, peaceful retirement died right there in the hospital hallway. The Special Forces operative woke up fully alert, fully cold, and fully prepared. Julian and his 5 sons thought they had won because they beat the police. They had absolutely no idea that they had just started a war with a man who specialized in tearing apart deeply entrenched targets. I was not going to yell. I was not going to threaten them. I was going to systematically hunt them, strip away their wealth, break their minds, and destroy their entire existence before they even realized they were bleeding. The drive from the hospital to the downtown police precinct was a blur of neon streetlights and freezing rain. I kept the truck's radio turned completely off. The silence inside the cab was heavy, filled only with the rhythmic, agonizing scrape of the windshield wipers. Every single time I blinked, I saw Amelia's pale face behind that thick intensive care window. I had to grip the steering wheel so hard my knuckles turned white, just to keep my hands from violently trembling. It was not sorrow shaking my bones anymore. It was pure unadulterated focus. When you spend 2 decades operating in the darkest, most hostile environments on Earth, you learn how to compartmentalize trauma. You learn how to take your panic, your grief, and your fear and fold them into a tiny silent square in the back of your mind. I was no longer a terrified father waiting for a monitor to flatline. I was a soldier stepping back into a war zone. I parked across the street from the police precinct. Detective Adrian had already told me that his hands were tied by the district attorney, but I needed to see the reality of the situation for myself. I needed to look the lie right in the face. As I walked up the wet concrete steps of the station, the heavy glass double doors swung open. Out walked Julian. He was wearing a flawless, custom-tailored charcoal overcoat. Not a single drop of rain or wrinkle on his frame. Flanking him were 2 of his oldest sons, Colin and Felix. They looked like carbon copies of their father, arrogant, sharp-jawed, and completely untouched by the horrific violence that had taken place just hours ago. A man in a sleek black suit, clearly an expensive defense attorney, walked half a step ahead of them, holding a leather briefcase like a shield. Julian stopped dead in his tracks when he saw me on the stairs. For a brief second, the mask slipped, and I saw a flash of genuine nervous calculation in his eyes, but he recovered instantly, replacing it with the practiced, somber expression of a grieving family member. "Victor," Julian said, his voice dripping with fabricated sympathy, "I cannot even begin to express how deeply sorry we are about this entire tragedy. We are all just devastated." I did not blink. I did not raise my voice. I just stared at him, letting the freezing rain hit my face. 14 times, Julian. A man defending himself from a grieving pregnant widow does not strike 14 times. The defense attorney immediately stepped between us, raising a perfectly manicured hand. "Mr. Victor, I strongly advise you to step aside. My client has just endured a deeply traumatic ordeal. The police have taken his official statement, and the preliminary ruling is clear self-defense during a severe psychological episode. Any further harassment will be met with immediate legal action." I ignored the lawyer entirely. My eyes flicked to Colin and Felix standing just behind their father. Felix was actually looking down at his phone, completely bored, as if he were waiting for a dinner reservation rather than leaving a police station after his sister-in-law was nearly murdered. Colin, however, met my gaze. He offered a tiny, almost imperceptible smirk. It was the smirk of a boy who knew his father's money made him utterly untouchable. She was completely out of her mind. "Victor," Julian continued, shaking his head with fake pity, "the pregnancy hormones, the grief over losing Hunter. She just snapped. She came to the estate demanding money, swinging a kitchen knife. My boys and I tried to hold her back. I only did what I absolutely had to do to protect my family. "Where are the other three?" I asked quietly. "Where are Blake, Grant, and Evan?" Julian's jaw tightened. "They went home to rest." As I said, this has been traumatizing for all of us. Traumatizing, I repeated, letting the word hang in the cold air. 5 grown men blocking the exits. 1 man with a blade and a pregnant woman bleeding out on a hardwood floor. "Step aside, Victor," Julian warned, dropping the sympathetic tone. His voice went cold and hard. "The police know the truth. The law is firmly on my side. Go back to the hospital and pray for your daughter. This is over." They brushed past me, walking down the steps toward a waiting luxury SUV. I did not turn to watch them leave. I already knew exactly what I was dealing with. Julian had purchased his own reality. He had bought a perfect alibi, and the justice system, blind and sluggish, had swallowed it whole. Instead of going inside the precinct, I walked back to my truck and drove straight to Julian's family estate on the edge of the city. The massive iron gates were open, and a single police cruiser sat in the driveway. Detective Adrian was standing on the front porch, smoking a cigarette, looking exhausted. "I told you not to come here, Victor." Adrian sighed as I walked up the marble steps. "Crime scene unit is already packing up. The district attorney is officially declining to press charges. They are ruling it justified use of force." "Let me see the room," I said. "I cannot do that," Adrian replied, shaking his head. "It is an active, it was an active scene." "Adrian," I said, my voice dropping to a growly whisper, "you have known me for a decade. Let me look at the room where my daughter was butchered. 5 minutes." Adrian stared at me, wearing with his own conscience. Finally he dropped his cigarette, crushed it beneath his boot, and stepped aside. "Do not touch anything." I walked through the grand double doors and down the long, luxurious hallway. The smell of copper hit me instantly. It was a smell I knew intimately from years of combat. I stepped into the sprawling private library. The furniture was made of heavy dark oak, and the walls were lined with expensive books. And then I saw it. The massive, horrifying pool of dark crimson staining the expensive Persian rug. But I didn't just see the blood. I saw the story. The police were too lazy or too corrupted to read. I slipped into my tactical mindset, analyzing the space like a battlefield. Julian claimed Amelia charged at him from the doorway, but the largest concentration of blood was in the far corner of the room, trapped between a heavy mahogany desk and a tall bookshelf. There was a smeared, bloody handprint on the wall, dragging downward. She did not charge at them. She was backing away. She was retreating. I looked at the floorboards near the entrance. There were deep, fresh scuff marks in the polished wood. 5 distinct sets of heavy shoe prints, overlapping, shifting side to side. Julian's 5 sons. They had formed a human barricade at the only exit. They had actively boxed her in. This was not a panicked moment of self-defense. This was a coordinated, deliberate cornering. It was an execution that had miraculously failed. My daughter fought for her life in this dark corner, while 5 men watched her bleed. I slowly walked back out of the room, the absolute silence of the grand house ringing in my ears. I walked past Adrian without saying a single word, got back into my truck, and drove home to my empty garage. The justice system had officially failed my daughter. The police were useless. But as I pulled a heavy, dust-covered steel trunk out from under my workbench and broke the padlock off, a strange sense of calm washed over me. I opened the lid, staring down at the tactical gear, the surveillance equipment, and the encrypted communication devices I had not touched in years. Julian thought he was the most dangerous man in this city because he had money and lawyers. He was about to find out what real danger actually looked like. The heavy steel lid of my footlocker creaked open, releasing the faint, familiar scent of gun oil and thick canvas. I stared down at the dark remnants of my past life. For 20 years, these tools kept me alive in the most hostile environments on the planet. I had buried them here in my dusty garage, hoping I would only ever need my hands to fix old engines and build wooden cribs for my grandchildren. I carefully lifted a matte black parabolic microphone and a set of high-grade thermal optics from the foam padding. The suffocating grief that had been crushing my chest just hours ago was entirely gone. It was replaced by the cold mechanical rhythm of a soldier preparing for a long, silent hunt. Julian and his boys thought they were untouchable because they had money. They did not understand that money only buys you temporary comfort. It does not buy you situational awareness. By 2 o'clock in the morning, the freezing rain had turned into a thick, icy mist. I parked my rusted truck 2 meters away from Julian's sprawling estate, hiking the rest of the way through the dense, muddy woods that bordered the back of his massive property. I wore dark, weather-resistant clothing, moving through the tree line without snapping a single twig. Decades of muscle memory took over. I found a cluster of thick oak trees on a small elevated ridge that offered a perfect unobstructed view of the grand glass windows at the rear of the mansion. I settled into the freezing mod, mounted my optics on a small tripod, and began my watch. Surveillance is never about fast action, it is about infinite patience. It is about watching human beings when they think nobody is looking, waiting for the tiny cracks in their arrogant armor to show. For 3 agonizing days and nights, I barely slept. I survived on cold bottled water and protein bars, ignoring the freezing temperatures, my eyes glued to the glass lenses. I meticulously documented every single detail of their daily routines. I watched Julian leave exactly at 8:15 a.m. every morning in his chauffeur luxury vehicle, always sharply dressed, always projecting absolute power, but the sons were the real targets. I needed to understand the 5 men who had stood shoulder to shoulder blocking the heavy oak doors while my pregnant daughter bled on the floor. If you understand the unbearable pain of watching guilty people live comfortable, lavish lives while your loved one fights for a single breath, hit like, subscribe for more betrayal stories, and comment your city or country. Because the hardest part of the mission was forcing myself to just sit in the mud and watch them smile. Through the magnified glass, I studied them closely. Colin and Felix were the loudest of the group. They hosted expensive dinners in the grand dining room, laughing and drinking premium wine as if nothing violent had ever happened in that house. They were deeply arrogant, completely insulated by their father's massive wealth. Blake was the enforcer type, spending hours in the estate's private gym, punching heavy leather bags with aggressive, angry energy. Grant was the shadow, rarely leaving his upstairs bedroom, only emerging to smoke cigarettes on the balcony while frantically typing on his phone. But it was the youngest son, Evan, who finally caught my full attention. On the 3rd night, a heavy thunderstorm rolled over the estate. Through the thermal optics, I watched Evan pacing back and forth in the downstairs study, the exact room where the brutal attack happened. He was not drinking fine wine like his older brothers. He was clutching a bottle of cheap liquor, his movements erratic and jerky. I adjusted the frequency dial on my parabolic microphone, aiming the dish directly at the slightly open window of the study. The audio hissed in my earpiece, cutting sharply through the sound of the heavy rain. "I cannot keep doing this," Evan muttered to himself, his voice trembling violently. Through the lens, I saw him drop the bottle. It shattered on the expensive Persian rug. He did not even flinch, he just sank to his knees, pressing his shaking hands against his face. A moment later, the study door swung violently open. Julian stepped into the room, his face twisted in sheer disgust. The microphone picked up the sharp, cruel tone of his voice perfectly. "Get off the floor, Evan," Julian snapped, stepping right over the broken glass. "You are embarrassing yourself. The police bought the story. The cameras are wiped." "It is over. She was not a threat," Evan cried out, his voice cracking with pure panic. "She was just standing there, Dad. She did not even have the knife. You handed it to shut your mouth," Julian hissed, grabbing Evan by the collar of his expensive shirt and hauling him forcefully to his feet. "Do you want to go to prison? Do you want to lose everything? You blocked that door just like your brothers. You are just as guilty. Now clean yourself up and act like a man, or I will let the police have you." Julian shoved him backward and stormed out of the room, leaving Evan shaking violently in the dark. I lowered my headset, a cold, dangerous smile spreading across my face in the freezing rain. Julian was an absolute fool. He thought he had built an impenetrable wall around his family. But every wall has a weak brick, and Evan was practically crumbling into dust. The youngest son was suffocating under the heavy weight of his own guilt and terror. He was terrified of the police, but more importantly, he was deeply terrified of his own father. I packed up my optics and quietly slipped back into the dark woods. I did not need to watch them anymore. I knew exactly where to strike first. I was going to isolate Evan, and I was going to squeeze his mind until the entire family shattered from the inside out. It was a Tuesday night when Evan finally left the estate alone. He drove his silver sports car to an upscale, dimly lit lounge downtown. He stayed inside for 3 hours, desperately trying to drown his guilt in expensive liquor. I did not follow him into the warm, crowded bar. I waited in the cold, damp underground parking garage beneath the building. The flickering fluorescent lights buzzed softly, casting long, dark shadows across the concrete. Evan finally stumbled out of the elevator just past midnight. He looked incredibly pale, jumping at the slightest sound. The heavy, empty garage echoed with his unsteady footsteps as he fumbled with his car keys, his hands shaking violently. I stepped out from behind a concrete pillar. I did not rush him, I did not raise my voice. I just stood under a flickering yellow light, perfectly still, letting him realize he was no longer alone. He dropped his keys, the metal clattered loudly against the floor. He spun around, his eyes wide with absolute terror when he recognized my face. He backed up fast, his spine hitting his car door, his chest heaving as if he could not catch his breath. "Please," he whispered, his voice cracking entirely. I didn't touch her. I took one slow, deliberate step forward. "I know you didn't, Evan," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "I know you just stood there and watched. I know you and your brothers blocked the heavy oak doors." He started shaking uncontrollably, tears instantly welling in his eyes. He looked like a frightened little boy, completely stripped of his family's arrogant armor. "You don't understand," he choked out, holding his hands up defensively. "My father, he controls absolutely everything. If we don't do exactly what he says, he destroys us. He told us we would all go to prison if we didn't back up his story of self-defense." I closed the distance between us until I was just a few feet away. I stared directly into his panicked eyes. "She did not even have the knife," I said, repeating the exact words I had recorded through my microphone in the rain. He handed it to her. All the blood drained from Evan's face. His knees actually buckled and he slid down the side of his expensive car, landing hard on the cold, damp concrete. He realized in that terrifying moment that his father's massive house was not a fortress. He realized I had been inside their walls. I have been listening to their darkest secrets. If you believe that true justice is a quiet, calculated storm, hit like, subscribe to Betrayal Stories Lab, and comment your city or country. Because breaking a guilty man's mind is far more effective than breaking his bones. "Why, Evan?" I asked, kneeling down so I was right at his eye level. I kept my voice incredibly calm, almost comforting. "That is how you break an interrogation subject. You do not scream at them. You become the only solid ground they have left to stand on. Why did Julian want my pregnant daughter dead? Tell me the truth right now and I will let you walk away." Evan buried his face in his trembling hands, sobbing openly in the empty garage. "It was the money," he wept. "It was always the money. My brother Hunter was the smart one. When my grandfather passed away, he left the controlling shares of the entire family empire to Hunter, not my dad. My dad was just a figurehead. He was furious." I listened, feeling a cold, heavy disgust tightening in my chest. "Keep going," I urged quietly. "When Hunter died in that car crash, control of the company was supposed to transfer automatically to his wife. To Amelia," Evan explained, gasping for air, "and eventually to the baby. My dad found out the day before the attack. He realized he was going to lose his entire fortune to a woman he hated. He said he had to remove the problem before the estate lawyers finalized the transfer. He invited her over to talk about Hunter's will, but it was a trap. He cornered her. We just stood there and let it happen." Complete silence fell over the garage. Julian had orchestrated a slaughter over corporate shares. He looked at my beautiful daughter, he looked at his own unborn grandchild, and he saw nothing but a financial obstacle that needed to be erased. I stood up slowly, looking down at the broken, weeping man on the floor. "You are going to keep quiet, Evan," I commanded softly. "You're going to go home and you're going to act perfectly normal. If you warn your father about this conversation, I will hand the audio recording of your confession directly to Detective Adrian. You will take the fall entirely alone." Evan nodded frantically, terrified. "I won't say a word. I swear, please, just let me go." I turned to walk away, leaving him trembling on the wet concrete. But before I reached the heavy metal doors of the stairwell, Evan called out to me. His voice was frantic, filled with a new, desperate urgency. "Victor, wait," he shouted, scrambling to his feet. "You don't have time to wait. The police aren't the problem anymore. My dad, he is going to family court tomorrow morning." I stopped slowly, turning back around. "What are you talking about?" "Amelia is on life support," Evan said, his voice dropping to a horrified whisper. "My dad hired a medical proxy lawyer. Since Hunter is dead and my dad is her closest related in-law with a clean police record, he is filing an emergency petition to take legal control of her medical decisions. The freezing air in the garage suddenly felt suffocating. He is going to the hospital tomorrow, Victor. Evan cried, tears streaming down his face. He is going to legally pull the plug. The sound of Evan's confession echoed in the damp concrete parking garage. My blood ran completely cold. Julian was not just trying to escape the law, he was orchestrating a legal execution in broad daylight. He was going to walk right past Dr. Daphne and use a judge's signature to end my daughter's life. The moment the machines turned off, the massive family fortune would officially default back to him. I left Evan shaking in the dark and drove my truck straight through the city at 90 meters an hour. I did not go to the hospital. I needed a different kind of weapon. I needed someone who understood the ruthless, twisted rules of corporate law better than Julian did. By 3 a.m., I was hammering my fist on the heavy wooden door of a historic brownstone. The porch light snapped on, illuminating the freezing rain. The door cracked open, revealing a sharp, intensely focused woman in a silk robe holding a steaming mug of black coffee. Fiona, she was the most vicious, brilliant estate lawyer in the city. More importantly, she hated Julian's guts. Years ago, Julian had tried to bankrupt her father's small business using predatory corporate tactics. Fiona had never forgotten that insult. "Victor," Fiona said, her eyes narrowing as she took in my soaked clothes and rigid posture. "It is 3 o'clock in the morning, someone had better be dead." "Not yet," I replied, my voice dangerously calm. "But Julian is going to court at dawn, to pull the plug on my daughter. I need you to stop him." Fiona's expression hardened instantly. She did not ask for details or offer useless sympathy. She stepped aside, motioning me into her warm book-lined study. She immediately booted up her laptop, her fingers flying across the keys with practiced predatory speed. I stood dripping rainwater on her expensive rug while she pulled up the public records of Hunter's massive estate. Julian is filing for emergency medical proxy based on his status as the closest surviving in-law. Fiona muttered, her eyes scanning the complex legal jargon glowing on the screen. "Because you are not blood-related to Hunter's wealth, the court heavily favors the husband's family when vast fortunes are tied to medical survival." "So, how do we break his claim?" I asked, pacing the room. Fiona stopped typing and leaned back in her leather chair. A slow, incredibly dangerous smile spread across her face. "Julian thinks he is the smartest man in the room. He thinks he knows every single clause in Hunter's will. But there is a massive legal blind spot he entirely missed. If you love seeing arrogant villains destroyed by their own greed, hit like, subscribe to Betrayal Stories Lab, and comment your city or country, because the trap we set for Julian was flawless." "What is the blind spot?" I demanded, stopping my pacing. "Hunter loved Amelia deeply," Fiona explained, turning the laptop screen toward me. 6 months before he died in that car crash, Hunter quietly amended the estate's corporate charter. He added a hostile action clause. It states that if any immediate family member is actively under investigation for causing physical harm to his wife, that family member is immediately stripped of all proxy rights and their access to the family wealth is entirely frozen. But Detective Adrian said the police closed the criminal investigation. I argued, frustration tightening my chest. They ruled it self-defense. Julian is not under active investigation anymore. Fiona's smile widened, sharp as broken glass. "Not by the local police, Victor. But this clause is incredibly broad. It does not specify law enforcement. It just says active investigation. If a licensed private investigator or an independent corporate auditor files a formal notice of investigation with the state, the clause triggers instantly. All of Julian's money, his accounts, and his legal standing freeze dead in their tracks." "Do it," I commanded softly. Fiona grabbed her phone, dialing a number before the sun even began to rise. "I am calling my private auditing firm. We are filing a massive aggressive investigation into the financial motives behind the attack. By 8 a.m., Julian is going to walk into that courthouse, expecting a victory lap, and he is going to walk right into a brick wall." Hours later, the bright morning sun pierced through the tall windows of the downtown family courthouse. I sat in the back row of the empty courtroom, my posture rigid, watching the heavy double doors swing open. Julian marched in, flanked by his 2 oldest sons, Blake and Colin. His high-priced defense attorney strutted right beside him, holding a thick folder filled with medical documents that were essentially a death warrant for my daughter. Julian spotted me sitting in the back. He offered a small, sickeningly smug smile. He genuinely believed he had already won. The judge, a tired-looking man with silver hair, took his seat at the bench. "We are here regarding the emergency medical proxy petition filed by Julian for the patient. Amelia," the judge announced, adjusting his glasses. "Are all parties present?" Julian's attorney stood up smoothly. "Yes, Your Honor, my client is simply seeking to end this tragic ordeal. The patient has no brain activity, and keeping her on life support is causing immense financial and emotional strain on the family estate." Before the judge could even nod, the heavy oak doors of the courtroom burst open. Fiona strode down the center aisle, her heels clicking aggressively against the marble floor. She slapped a thick red-stamped document directly onto the defense attorney's table. "Objection, Your Honor," Fiona stated, her voice echoing with absolute authority. "The petitioner has entirely lost his legal standing. As of exactly 10 minutes ago, an independent financial investigation was formally launched against Julian and his 5 sons, directly triggering the hostile action clause in the deceased husband's estate charter." Julian's face went completely pale. He grabbed the document, his eyes scanning the aggressive legal notice. "Furthermore," Fiona continued, turning her cold gaze directly onto Julian, "pursuant to that exact clause, all of the petitioner's corporate assets, personal bank accounts, and family trust funds are immediately frozen pending the outcome of the audit. My client's daughter remains on life support, and you, Julian, are officially locked out of the empire." The judge slammed his gavel. "Petition for medical proxy denied. Assets frozen. We are adjourned." Julian stood perfectly still, his perfectly tailored suit suddenly feeling like a straitjacket. He looked at Fiona, and then he slowly turned to look at me in the back row. The arrogant, untouchable millionaire was gone. In his eyes, I finally saw the absolute suffocating panic of a man who realized his entire kingdom had just burned to the ground. The massive mahogany doors of the courthouse slammed violently behind Julian. He stormed out onto the cold marble steps, his face completely flushed with pure rage. His 2 oldest sons, Blake and Colin, practically jogged to keep up with his furious pace. The expensive defense attorney trailed slightly behind them, desperately speaking into his cell phone. I stood calmly near the thick columns of the courthouse entrance, my hands buried deep in the pockets of my worn jacket. I watched them unravel in real time. The quiet, calculating part of my brain, the part honed by decades of breaking enemy networks, was entirely satisfied. The legal ambush had worked flawlessly. Julian's money was the only armor he had ever known, and Fiona had just ripped it clean off his back. "Call the bank right now!" Julian screamed at his lawyer, entirely abandoning his composed, aristocratic persona in front of dozens of passing civilians. "Tell them to transfer the offshore reserve funds before the freeze hits the secondary accounts. Move everything." The lawyer lowered his phone, his face pale and slick with nervous sweat. "Julian, you do not understand. The hostile action clause your brother inserted into the charter is absolute iron. The audit triggered an automatic global freeze across every single financial institution tied to your name. Your credit lines are dead. Your corporate cards are declining. Your liquid assets are completely inaccessible." Blake, the muscle of the family, grabbed the lawyer by the lapels of his expensive suit. "Fix it," he roared, shaking the smaller man violently. "We have payroll tomorrow. We have millions tied up in the new development project." Julian slapped his son's hands away, his chest heaving with panic. "Let him go, Blake. We are making a scene." He turned slowly, his eyes locking directly onto me, standing by the columns. The raw hatred burning in his gaze was palpable, but beneath it, there was a new deep-seated terror. If you love watching an arrogant villain lose absolutely everything they value, hit like, subscribe to Betrayal Stories Lab, and comment your city or country, because the destruction of Julian's empire had only just begun. I did not smile. I did not taunt him. I just stared back with cold, dead eyes, letting him drown in the silence of his own ruin. Within 48 hours, the financial freeze began to completely suffocate the family estate. Without access to their massive wealth, Julian's carefully constructed world of power and intimidation instantly crumbled. The private security team guarding the mansion walked off the job when their direct deposits bounced. The housekeeping staff quit, leaving the grand house silent and empty. The high-priced defense attorney formally dropped them as clients the moment his retainer check failed to clear the bank. But I was not just going to let them sit in an empty mansion. I was going to systematically strip away their entire legacy. I sat in my dark garage, staring at the glowing screen of my encrypted laptop. I had spent years tracking illicit funds and exposing corruption during my military service. Julian's business empire was built on a mountain of fraud, blackmail, and illegal corporate espionage. With Fiona's aggressive legal audit acting as a massive smoke screen, I easily slipped past his company's weakened cyber defenses. I spent an entire night downloading heavily encrypted ledgers, offshore shell company documents, and emails detailing years of brutal corporate sabotage. Julian had ruined dozens of small businesses, bribed local officials, and stolen intellectual property to build his wealth. It was all right there in black and white. I did not hand the evidence over to the police. Detective Adrian and the corrupt local district attorney had already proven they were useless. Instead, I compiled the raw data into hundreds of massive, undeniable files. At exactly 6 a.m. the next morning, I hit a single button on my keyboard. The files were simultaneously anonymously emailed to every single major business partner, corporate investor, and rival CEO in the state. I also sent blind copies to 3 federal regulatory agencies and several prominent investigative journalists. I bypassed the local corruption entirely and set fire to Julian's reputation on a national level. By noon, the fallout was absolutely catastrophic. I drove my rusted truck to the edge of the sprawling estate and parked near the massive wrought iron gates. The gates were chained shut. The property looked like a ghost town. Through my thermal optics, I watched the chaos unfolding inside the main house. Julian's business partners were ruthlessly cutting ties through the parabolic microphone. I heard the endless ringing of the mansion's landline phones. "Dad, the board of directors just voted to expel you entirely," Colin screamed, his voice echoing loudly through the grand empty hallway. He was pacing furiously, clutching his phone like a lifeline. "The stock is plummeting. The investors are threatening a massive class action lawsuit for fraud." Julian was sitting in a heavy leather chair in the study, staring blankly at the wall. The flawless custom-tailored suits were gone. He was wearing wrinkled slacks and a loose shirt, his face unshaven and deeply exhausted. He looked 20 years older. "We have to liquidate the secondary properties," Julian muttered, his voice devoid of its usual arrogant command. "We have to sell the vacation homes to pay for the federal defense lawyers. The feds are going to raid the corporate offices by tomorrow. We cannot sell anything." Blake roared, storming into the room and violently kicking a heavy oak table. Fiona's freeze locked the deeds. "We are trapped, Dad. The feds are coming. The money is gone. And the entire city knows you are a fraud." The youngest son, Evan, was curled up in the corner of the room, crying quietly. He was the only one who truly understood what was happening. He knew this was not just bad luck. He knew I was systematically destroying their lives, piece by piece, just like I promised him in that dark parking garage. Julian finally stood up, his hands shaking as he poured a glass of cheap whiskey from a dusty decanter. The expensive liquor was long gone. "We still have the private jet," he said slowly, a dangerous, desperate edge creeping into his voice. "The plane is registered under an offshore shell company that the audit hasn't hit yet. We pack whatever cash we have hidden in the floorboards. We leave the country tonight." I lowered my headset, a cold, satisfied hum vibrating in my chest. They thought they could run. They thought they could escape the consequences of nearly butchering my pregnant daughter by hiding in a foreign country, but they did not understand that I had already anticipated their cowardice. I had already sealed the borders of their little kingdom. The real hunt was finally about to begin. The rain had finally stopped, but the damp, freezing cold still clung to the city like a heavy blanket. Inside the massive empty family estate, Julian and his sons were tearing the house apart. Through my thermal optics, I watched them ripping up floorboards in the private study, desperately stuffing stacks of hidden, untraceable cash into duffel bags. The grand mansion they had once proudly defended was now nothing more than a sinking ship. Julian had ordered his sons to pack only the essentials. They were going to board a private jet registered to a ghost company and disappear before the federal auditors and the FBI could officially seize their passports. They thought they had a clean escape route. But I was not going to let the men who nearly butchered my pregnant daughter just fly away. When you corner a pack of wolves, the most effective strategy is not to fight them all at once. The most effective strategy is to convince them that the real danger is standing right next to them. I needed to turn their blood against their own blood. I needed to make them tear each other apart before they ever reached the runway. If you enjoy seeing arrogant cowards destroy each other from the inside out, hit like, subscribe to Betrayal Stories Lab, and comment your city or country, because the psychological warfare I unleashed on Julian's family was absolute perfection. I drove my truck to a small, completely untraceable internet cafe on the edge of the city. I logged into a secure encrypted network. I had already hacked into the private servers of Julian's closest legal advisors. I did not need to forge complicated documents. I just needed to plant a single incredibly destructive seed of doubt in the minds of the 4 older sons, Blake, Colin, Felix, and Grant. I drafted an email designed to look exactly like an urgent confidential communication from the lead federal prosecutor's office directly addressed to Julian's former high-priced defense attorney. The subject line read, "Immunity deal confirmed status." The body of the email was brief, cold, and devastatingly precise. It stated that a full immunity agreement had been officially offered and quietly accepted by one of the 5 sons in exchange for a full recorded confession regarding the horrific attack on Amelia. The email did not name which son had flipped. It simply stated that the cooperating witness had already provided the FBI with enough physical evidence to guarantee life sentences for the other 4 brothers and their father. I set the email to automatically forward directly to the private smartphones of Blake, Colin, Felix, and Grant. I specifically excluded the youngest son, Evan, because he was already utterly broken and useless to the dynamic. At exactly 9 p.m., I sat in my truck parked near the estate gates and watched my phone screen. The delivery confirmation flashed green. All 4 emails had landed simultaneously. Through the parabolic microphone aimed at the massive living room window, I listened as the absolute silence of the house was violently shattered. "Which one of you did it?" Blake's deep, furious voice roared through my earpiece. The sound of a heavy duffel bag hitting the hardwood floor echoed loudly. "Did what?" Colin snapped back, his voice thick with panic and confusion. "Do not lie to me," Blake screamed, the sound of breaking glass immediately following his words. Through the thermal optics, I saw the massive heat signature of Blake lunging across the room, slamming someone hard against the expensive mahogany bookshelf. "I just got a leaked federal email. One of you rats took an immunity deal. One of you is selling us out to the feds to save your own skin. Get off me, Blake," Felix shouted, his voice cracking with absolute terror. "I didn't talk to anyone. I swear to God." Julian's heavy footsteps stormed into the room. "What in the world is going on down here?" he demanded, his voice shaking with the exhaustion of a man who had not slept in 3 days. "We are leaving for the airstrip in 20 minutes. Stop fighting, there is no airstrip." "Dad!" Grant yelled, pacing frantically near the broken glass. "Look at your phone. The feds already have a confession. One of us talked about Amelia. One of us told them exactly how you cornered her." The silence that followed was suffocating. Through the microphone, I could hear their heavy, panicked breathing. The arrogance was completely gone. The deep, unified family loyalty that had allowed them to stand shoulder to shoulder while my daughter bled out was rapidly dissolving into pure toxic paranoia. "Show me the email," Julian ordered, his voice dropping to a terrifying dead whisper. There was a long pause as Julian read the glowing screen of Grant's phone. When he finally spoke, his voice was hollow. "It doesn't name the witness. It just says one of my sons." Julian slowly looked up, his gaze sweeping across his own blood. He no longer saw a unified front. He saw 4 desperate, terrified men, any one of whom could be the rat holding the key to his prison cell. "Empty your pockets," Julian commanded, stepping back toward the doorway, physically distancing himself from his own children. "Right now, all of you, hand over your phones. I am not boarding a plane with a federal informant." "You are insane," Colin yelled, backing away. "You think I would sell out my own father? You are the one who dragged us into this. You are the one who told us to block the doors." "Shut your mouth," Julian screamed, completely losing his mind. "Empty your pockets." The fight that erupted was entirely predictable. Paranoia is a cancer that devours everything it touches. Blake shoved Colin. Felix tried to run for the front door. Grant screamed at his father, his voice cracking under the immense pressure. They were animals trapped in a cage, violently turning on each other to survive. I sat in the freezing cab of my truck, a cold, dark satisfaction settling deep in my chest. The empire was stripped, the money was gone, and the family was officially broken. Now it was time to trap the rats. Through the glowing green lens of my thermal optics, I watched Julian and his sons completely unravel inside their massive empty mansion. The family that had arrogantly stood shoulder to shoulder while my pregnant daughter bled was now a panicked, paranoid mess. The fake federal email I had planted worked like absolute poison. They were terrified of each other, constantly accusing one another of wearing a wire or cutting a secret immunity deal. But terror was a powerful motivator, and despite the chaos, Julian's raw survival instinct finally kicked in. He knew the FBI would raid the estate by morning, he knew his bank accounts were entirely frozen, he knew he had to get his remaining loyal sons on that private jet, even if he didn't trust them anymore. At 11:30 p.m., the heavy iron gates of the estate swung open. A sleek black SUV tore out onto the wet, empty road, its headlights cutting through the freezing mist. Julian was driving erratically, entirely desperate. I dropped my optics, threw my rusted truck into gear, and pulled out of the shadows, trailing them from a safe, undetectable distance. I knew exactly where they were going. When I had hacked Julian's encrypted ledgers, I found a hidden property deed registered under a shell corporation. It was an abandoned, reinforced concrete warehouse located 20 meters outside the city, near a small private airstrip. Julian used it as a secure holding facility for his illegal offshore shipments. Now, it was his final escape route. If you believe there is no escape for cowards who hurt innocent families, hit like, subscribe to Betrayal Stories Lab, and comment your city or country, because the trap I set for Julian was already locked tight. The drive took 40 tense minutes. The black SUV finally turned off the main highway onto a deeply rutted, unlit dirt road. I killed my truck's headlights and relied entirely on my night vision goggles, steering quietly through the dense tree line. I parked a half-mile away from the massive dark warehouse and approached on foot, moving like a ghost through the freezing mud. Julian's SUV was parked haphazardly near the heavy steel loading doors. The engine was still ticking as it cooled in the damp air. Inside the warehouse, weak yellow emergency lights flickered on. I crept up to a small, grimy window near the ground floor and peered inside. Julian, Blake, Colin, Felix, and Grant were standing in the center of the vast empty concrete floor. They were surrounded by heavy wooden crates. Their duffel bags full of stolen cash dropped carelessly at their feet. They looked completely exhausted, constantly looking over their shoulders. The pilot said he needs 20 minutes to prep the jet, Julian muttered, pacing nervously, his breath visible in the freezing air of the warehouse. Once we are in the air, the feds cannot touch us. We land in non-extradition territory and figure out how to unfreeze the offshore accounts later. And what if the rat is standing right here? Blake growled, glaring dangerously at his brother Grant. What if one of us is just waiting for the FBI to surround the airstrip? Shut up, Blake, Julian snapped, rubbing his temples furiously. Just keep your mouth shut until we are on the plane. I stepped away from the window, a cold, humorless smile touching my lips. They were entirely focused on the sky, waiting for a plane that was never going to come. I had already visited the private airstrip 3 hours ago. I had permanently disabled the jet's landing gear and severed the main fuel line. The pilot had taken one look at the damage, panicked, and fled into the night. But I was not just going to let them wait in the cold, I was going to lock them inside their own tomb. I moved silently to the main electrical junction box bolted to the exterior concrete wall of the warehouse. Using a set of heavy bolt cutters, I completely severed the main power lines. The weak yellow lights inside the building instantly died, plunging Julian and his sons into pitch-black darkness. Before they could even react, I moved to the heavy steel loading doors. I wrapped a thick industrial-grade logging chain through the exterior handles and secured it with a massive steel padlock. I repeated the process on the only other exit, a reinforced side door near the office. Inside the warehouse, absolute chaos erupted. "What happened to the lights?" Colin screamed, his voice echoing loudly off the concrete walls. "Somebody is out there," Felix yelled, panic completely taking over. Through the thick steel doors, I heard the sound of Julian's heavy flashlight clicking on. A frantic beam of light swept across the dirty windows. "Get to the side door," Julian ordered, his voice cracking with sheer terror. "Get to the door right now." I stood perfectly still in the freezing mist, listening as heavy footsteps pounded against the concrete floor inside. They hit the reinforced side door hard, throwing their entire body weight against the steel. The heavy logging chain I had installed barely even rattled. "It's locked." Blake roared violently, kicking the metal. "It's chained from the outside. Dad, we are trapped in here. Break the windows." Julian screamed desperately. "They are reinforced glass with steel bars." "Dad," Grant cried out, his voice bordering on total hysteria. "We cannot get out. We are completely locked in." I slowly walked away from the steel doors, pulling a small encrypted radio from my tactical vest. I keyed the microphone, broadcasting a signal on the exact frequency of Julian's private security walkie-talkies. The radio clipped to Julian's belt inside the warehouse suddenly crackled to life in the darkness. 14 times, Julian, I said, my voice echoing coldly through the cavernous black space. You and your boys blocked the exits while my pregnant daughter bled on the floor. Now I am blocking yours. The absolute silence that followed my words was the sound of complete, suffocating defeat. The hunters were finally the hunted. The heavy steel doors of the abandoned warehouse shuddered violently as Julian and his 4 remaining sons threw their bodies against the reinforced metal. The deafening sound of their panicked kicks echoed into the freezing night. Inside the pitch-black, cavernous space, they were screaming at each other, entirely stripped of the arrogance that had protected them for so long. My voice over the encrypted radio had paralyzed them. They finally realized that the FBI was not hunting them. I was. I stood perfectly still in the freezing mist outside the warehouse. Leaning against a rusted steel drum, I pulled my tactical thermal optics down over my eyes. Through the thick, dirty windows, I watched 5 glowing red heat signatures scrambling like trapped rats across the concrete floor. "Break the glass!" Julian roared, his flashlight beam slicing frantically through the dark. "Find a pipe. Find a hammer. Break it right now." Blake, the largest and most aggressive of the brothers, hoisted a heavy wooden crate over his head and hurled it violently at the reinforced window. The crate shattered into splinters, but the thick wire mesh glass did not even crack. The steel bars welded to the frame held perfectly solid. "It's not breaking, Dad," Blake screamed, his chest heaving with exhaustion and pure terror. "We are sealed in. If you love seeing untouchable monsters finally realize they are entirely trapped in their own lies, hit like, subscribe to Betrayal Stories Lab, and comment your city or country, because the silence I created inside that warehouse was about to shatter their entire family. I keyed the microphone on my encrypted radio again. The small device clipped to Julian's belt crackled to life, my voice cutting through their panic like a razor blade. "Julian," I said softly, the calm rhythm of my voice echoing into the massive space. "You have $20 million frozen in offshore accounts. You have 5 sons who blocked a door while a pregnant woman bled, and you have absolutely nowhere to run. Which one of you is going to confess to the police first?" "Shut up!" Julian screamed at his radio, ripping it off his belt and throwing it furiously against the concrete wall. The plastic casing shattered, instantly severing my connection. The silence that followed was suffocating. Through the thermal optics, I watched the 5 men freeze, their heavy breathing creating thick white clouds in the freezing air. The paranoia I had carefully planted with the fake federal email was about to completely detonate. "It was you, wasn't it?" Colin hissed, stepping slowly toward his youngest brother, Grant. The beam of Julian's flashlight caught the absolute hatred in Colin's eyes. "You tipped him off. You are the rat who took the immunity deal." Grant backed away instantly, his hands raised in pure terror. "I didn't. I swear to God, Colin, I didn't say a word to anyone. He must have tracked Dad's SUV." "Liar," Blake roared, lunging forward and grabbing Grant violently by the collar of his expensive jacket. He slammed him hard against a heavy steel pillar. "You always wanted out. You always hated the family business. Tell me the truth or I will break your neck right here." "Stop it," Julian ordered desperately, shining the flashlight directly into Blake's eyes. "Let him go. We cannot fight each other." "He set us up, Dad," Blake screamed back, refusing to release his grip. "He is the reason the feds have the confession. He is the reason Victor is outside." "I didn't tell them anything," Grant shrieked, tears streaming down his face. "Because I didn't need to tell them. They already have the video." The entire warehouse went dead silent. Even from outside, I felt the freezing air suddenly drop another 10 degrees. I lowered my thermal optics, my heart pounding hard against my ribs. "What video?" Julian asked, his voice dropping to a horrified growly whisper. Grant was sobbing uncontrollably now, sliding slowly down the steel pillar as Blake loosened his grip in sheer shock. "The security camera in the study," Grant gasped, wiping his nose with a shaking hand. "The one you told me to disable before Amelia arrived that night. I told you to wipe the hard drive," Julian snapped, stepping closer, the flashlight beam shaking violently in his hand. "I watched you format the system. I formatted the main system, Dad," Grant wept, entirely broken. "But I backed up the raw footage to a hidden encrypted flash drive before I wiped the server. I kept it." Felix let out a loud, hysterical laugh. You kept a video of us trying to murder Amelia. Are you out of your mind? I needed insurance. Grant screamed, his voice echoing off the high ceilings. You treat me like garbage. You cut me out of the trust fund. I knew if the cops ever found a hole in your self-defense lie, you would pin the entire attack on me. I kept the video so I could prove you handed her the knife. Julian stared at his son, his face completely pale in the harsh light. The perfect crime he had constructed, the ironclad lie that had kept him out of prison, was entirely recorded. A hidden camera had captured every single strike, every drop of blood, and the 5 men who stood shoulder to shoulder to ensure my pregnant daughter could not escape. Where is the flash drive, Grant? Julian asked softly, a terrifyingly cold, dead look settling into his eyes. It's in my duffel bag, Grant whispered, terrified. Right there on the floor. I didn't wait to hear another word. I moved violently away from the window, pulling a heavy tactical breaching charge from my vest. The family had completely destroyed itself. The truth was no longer buried in a hospital room. It was locked inside a plastic flash drive sitting on a concrete floor. I was not just going to let them fight over it. I was going to walk through the front door and take it. The heavy, suffocating silence inside the pitch-black warehouse was broken only by the sound of Julian's frantic, heavy breathing. Through the thick, dirt-caked glass, I watched 5 men staring in absolute terror at a dark canvas duffel bag sitting on the freezing concrete floor. Inside that bag was a small, encrypted flash drive holding the undeniable truth of my daughter's attempted murder. The carefully constructed lie of self-defense was officially dead. The empire of wealth, arrogance, and corrupt lawyers had completely evaporated. Get the bag, Blake, Julian ordered, his voice trembling violently as he kept his flashlight beam pinned on the youngest brother, Grant. Grab the drive and smash it to pieces right now. Blake hesitated, his eyes darting frantically between his father, the duffel bag, and the massive chained steel doors. Dad, if we destroy it, and the feds already know about it, they will charge us with destroying evidence. There are no feds, you absolute fool, Julian screamed, finally losing the last shred of his composure. It's Victor out there. He planted the fake email. He turned us against each other. Just break the drive so he cannot use it against us. I did not give Blake the chance to move. I stepped up to the heavy steel loading doors, moving with the quiet, terrifying precision of a soldier who had spent 20 years breaching enemy compounds. I pressed a strip of tactical explosive putty directly against the heavy industrial padlock, securing the thick logging chains. I stepped back into the freezing mist, raised a small remote detonator, and pressed the button. The explosion was deafening. A bright, violent flash of white light illuminated the entire exterior of the warehouse, followed instantly by a concussive shockwave that rattled the steel walls. The heavy padlock shattered into a dozen pieces of hot shrapnel, and the thick chains clattered heavily to the concrete floor. Before the thick cloud of smoke and dust could even settle, I kicked the heavy steel doors wide open and stepped into the pitch-black cavern. If you love watching untouchable villains finally face the raw, terrifying consequences of their own actions, hit like, subscribe to Betrayal Stories Lab, and comment your city or country, because the silence that followed the explosion was the sound of Julian's entire world permanently collapsing. I did not rush them. I did not yell. I just walked slowly into the massive space, my heavy boots echoing sharply against the concrete. I held a blindingly bright tactical flashlight in my left hand, sweeping the beam across the 5 terrified men. They were entirely frozen in the center of the room, shielding their eyes from the harsh, piercing light. Step away from the bag, I commanded, my voice dropping to a growly, dead calm. He's alone, Colin yelled, his voice cracking with sheer panic. Dad, there's no cops, it's just him. Blake, fueled by pure adrenaline and terror, lunged forward toward the duffel bag on the floor. I didn't hesitate. I dropped my flashlight, letting it roll across the concrete, illuminating the room in sharp, chaotic angles. As Blake grabbed the strap of the bag, I closed the distance between us in 3 rapid, silent steps. I grabbed him by the collar of his expensive jacket, spun his massive frame around, and drove my knee hard into his stomach. As he gasped for air, I swept his legs out from under him, sending him crashing violently onto the freezing floor. He didn't even try to get back up. Nobody else moves, I stated softly, staring directly into Julian's panicked eyes. Felix and Grant instantly backed away, throwing their hands up in absolute surrender. The arrogance they had displayed in the police station days ago was completely gone. They were nothing but terrified boys hiding behind a father who could no longer protect them. Julian stood his ground, though his hands were shaking violently as he gripped his own flashlight. He looked at Blake, groaning on the floor, and then he looked at me. "Victor, listen to me," Julian stammered, his voice dripping with desperate fake negotiation. "We can fix this. You know how much money I have. I can transfer millions into an offshore account in your name right now. You and Amelia will never have to work another day in your lives. Just let us walk out of here." I stared at him for a long, heavy moment. "Your money is frozen, Julian. Your accounts are dead. Fiona locked you out of the Empire days ago. You are entirely bankrupt." Julian swallowed hard, realizing the trap was perfectly sealed. "Please, Victor," we panicked. She was screaming. "We didn't mean to." 14 times, Julian, I interrupted, my voice as cold as the freezing mist pouring through the open doors. "You handed her a kitchen knife, cornered her in a dark study, and struck her 14 times while your sons blocked the only exit. That is not panic, that is an execution." I slowly bent down, never taking my eyes off of Julian, and unzipped the dark canvas duffel bag. I pulled out a small black encrypted flash drive. The entire truth was sitting right in the palm of my hand. "I am not going to hurt you, Julian," I said quietly, slipping the drive into the secure pocket of my tactical vest. "I am going to do something much worse. I am going to let you live in a tiny concrete cage for the rest of your miserable life." Knowing that your own son recorded you tearing your family apart, Julian dropped to his knees on the freezing floor, burying his face in his shaking hands. He knew it was entirely over. Behind me, the wail of police sirens suddenly cut through the night air. Red and blue lights began flashing through the dense trees. Detective Adrian had finally received the anonymous, untraceable tip I sent him 30 minutes ago regarding heavily armed men breaking into an abandoned warehouse. I turned my back on the broken man, walked out the heavy steel doors, and melted quietly back into the dark, freezing woods. The hunt was officially over. The flashing red and blue lights of the police cruisers cut sharply through the freezing mist, reflecting off the broken windows of the abandoned warehouse. I stood perfectly still in the dense tree line, entirely concealed by the shadows, watching the final act of Julian's pathetic, arrogant life unfold. Dozens of heavily armed officers swarmed the massive steel doors I had just blown open. Detective Adrian was leading the charge, his weapon drawn. Through my thermal optics, I watched Julian and his 4 remaining sons, Blake, Colin, Felix, and Grant, shoved violently against the cold concrete floor. The men who had arrogantly studded out of the police precinct just days earlier, completely insulated by millions of dollars and corrupt lawyers, were now screaming and crying as heavy steel cuffs locked tightly around their wrists. I pulled the small encrypted flash drive from my tactical vest. I didn't need to hand it to Adrian personally. I had already made a secure, untraceable copy and sent it directly to the district attorney, the federal investigators handling Fiona's corporate audit, and every major news outlet in the city. The undeniable brutal footage of Julian forcing a kitchen knife into my pregnant daughter's hand while his sons blocked the heavy oak doors was already entirely out of his control. The lie of self-defense was dead. Their empire had been completely dismantled. They were going to spend whatever remained of their miserable lives rotting inside a 6x8 concrete cell, terrified of one another, stripped entirely of every dollar they once had. The hunt was finally finished. I lowered my optics, turned away from the flashing lights behind me, and walked slowly through the freezing mud back toward my rusted truck. The drive back into the city felt completely different this time. That suffocating pressure that had been crushing my chest ever since I first saw blood on the hospital floor had fully lifted. I left the radio off, but the silence inside the cab no longer carried panic. It carried the quiet, complete peace of justice finally delivered. The sun was just starting to rise, painting the city skyline in warm shades of gold as I pushed through the heavy glass doors of the intensive care unit. The sharp smell of bleach still lingered, but the frantic energy that once filled the hospital had settled down completely. I walked down the long, quiet corridor and froze outside Amelia's room. Dr. Daphne stood in the doorway holding a clipboard. The moment she spotted me, her tired face broke into a wide, tearful smile. "Victor," she whispered gently, stepping to the side. "She's awake." My heart pounded hard against my ribs. I practically ran into the room. Amelia lay in the hospital bed, bathed in soft morning light. The machines still hummed quietly around her, but the breathing tube was finally gone. She looked pale and fragile, her dark hair spread across the white pillow, but her eyes, her mother's same kind, forgiving eyes, were open. As I reached the edge of the bed, her gaze found mine instantly. She slowly raised a weak, trembling hand toward me. I dropped to my knees at once, gently taking her fingers and pressing them to my forehead as the tears I'd been holding back for days finally broke loose. "Dad," she rasped, her voice barely audible, yet the most beautiful sound I had ever heard in my entire life. "Is the baby okay?" I nodded frantically, too overwhelmed to speak, my throat tight with emotion. I gently rested my hand over her stomach. "The baby's perfectly fine, Amelia. You saved him. You are the strongest person I've ever known." She closed her eyes, one tear sliding down her cheek, a faint, relieved smile forming on her lips. "Julian, his men," she choked out, the memory of the attack suddenly resurfacing. "They're gone, sweetheart," I said, my voice softening into something calm and steady. I squeezed her hand gently. "They can never hurt you or this family again. The house, the money, all their lies, it's all gone completely. They're locked away for good, and they will never see their son again. You're safe now, entirely safe." Amelia let out a long, shaky breath, the deep, terrifying tension finally draining from her body. The nightmare was over. We didn't need 6 months or a year to know we had won. The victory was right there in that soft morning light, in the steady, strong heartbeat of my daughter and the grandchild she still carried. The men who had tried to bury our family were locked away in cages, broken entirely by their own greed and paranoia. Meanwhile, we would walk out of this hospital and build something beautiful and quiet together. Real justice was never just about destroying monsters, it was about surviving them, and thriving in the very light they had tried so desperately to steal from us.